So we're going to try something a little bit different today on stream. What we're going to try to do is actually like do sort of like a psychoanalysis of Squid Game. And then if we have time, we'll review some Reddit posts. Hopefully we'll do that. So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to do something like a psychoanalysis of Squid Game. There are a lot of disclaimers that I have to toss out. So the first is that, I think it's I'm doing it for fun, and it's sort of like more for entertainment than education. So what we're going to kind of do is like, I'm going to give you guys a list of like diagnoses and see if y'all can pair up like which character in the game has what diagnosis. And so this is like very irresponsible in some ways. So like, let me just explain a couple of things. So the first is that to actually obtain a diagnosis is an in-depth and like careful process. So when I do a real diagnostic interview with like a human being, it takes like 90 minutes to 2 hours. I'll ask somewhere between 40 and 100 questions. And so there's like a lot of like specificity and carefulness that goes into it. So today what we're going to do is just kind of slap diagnoses on people to sort of illustrate certain points, because I do think that part of the reason that I wanted to do this in terms of like, even though it's, a little bit irresponsible, like people will, but I do think that there's a value to it, because I think there's a big stigma around mental illness. And I think that when popular media like portrays mental illness, I think it can actually be useful, because it illustrates like certain points and helps people like understand or maybe even identify with some of the characters. And if you identify with some of the characters or some of the traits sound like they kind of feel like you, I would strongly encourage you to go see a licensed mental health professional and like actually get help. So the other thing to understand about Squid Game is that it's like fiction, right? So not only are we not asking them questions, but we're also like, it's all like everything is like blown up by like 10 times. So things are more extreme. It's a very like unrealistic scenario. And I think a lot of the portrayals of like mental health and diagnoses are sort of like exacerbated or exaggerated. So let's just keep that in mind as well. The third thing is that when I use the phrase psychoanalysis, we're not talking about actual psychoanalysis. So that's like a deep process that has a lot of different theories. Basically, what we're going to be doing is like kind of hypothesizing about different diagnoses, but colloquially, when people talk about that, they use the term psychoanalysis. So we're not actually doing psychoanalysis here. It's just, that's not what we're doing. But overall, and then the last disclaimer is that, there's going to be like huge and massive spoilers for this. So if you guys have not seen Squid Game, like don't watch this. Like, go do something else and come back and watch it. So we're not going to hold back on the spoilers at all. I'm going to assume that everyone here has seen it. Part of the reason I wanted to do it now is because if you guys have seen it, it'll be fresh in your mind. So I'm going to talk about particular scenes. Okay, so we good? If you want to go watch it right now, like now is the time. So let's get started. Okay, so this is what we're going to do, all right? I'm going to go ahead and start by giving you guys kind of a list of diagnoses, or like it's not necessarily diagnoses. So what we're going to try to do is pair up some of these like conditions or psychological phenomenon with different fictional characters, okay? So our categories are going to be like depression, bipolar, anxiety, addiction, an attachment disorder, PTSD, reaction formation, or suppression, actually. So these are like defense mechanisms, sociopathy, and borderline personality disorder, okay? So if you guys are not familiar with what these are, that's actually like perfectly fine. It's not that big of a deal. For those of you that are a little bit familiar with this, I encourage you to kind of think a little bit about what, who you think has what, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with, so what I'm going to do is like, we're going to start actually at the top. So we're going to start with the main character. And once again, I'm going to butcher these pronunciations, so I apologize. So this is like the main character of the show. His name is Gihun, right? So let's just talk a little bit about Gihun, or the English, whatever, that's sort of how they spell his name. So this is a guy who's like, first of all, he's broke, right? So he doesn't have a whole lot of money. And then like the first thing that he, like in the first episode, what he does is he steals his mom's credit card, withdraws cash, takes his money to like a horse racing place, loses some money, bets again, and then wins, right? So then he's thrilled. He's got a bunch of cash. He is divorced and like makes big promises to his daughter, and like his daughter sort of isn't disappointed when he fails to deliver on his promises, right? She kind of knows what her dad is like. She knows her dad is unreliable. She knows that he's gonna like make big promises and not live up to them. And so then what happens is Gihun like joins the Squid Game out of like desperation, right? And then he goes through the Squid Game, and once again, huge spoiler alert, he wins. And so then he gets this huge pile of money. In theory, all of his problems should be solved. And despite the fact that all of his problems are solved, he like is a bum for a year, drinks booze, and then kind of randomly like goes and colors his hair, and then doesn't kind of know what to do with himself. And he's going to go see his kid. He's going to go like live a normal life. And on the verge of actually boarding the airplane and like, you know, going to see his kid and maybe living a regular life, he turns around and decides to walk away from the airplane. And the presumption is that he's actually going to join like Squid Game round 2. So like the diagnosis here is absolutely like gambling addiction, okay? So this is a guy that, you know, just can't stop. So like despite the fact that he, you know, it seems like he has a regular kind of like buddy that he goes and gambles with. He's broke. Probably part of the reason that he's broke is it appears that he's had like several jobs, but he can't like store money away. It seems like he's, you know, failed to show up for his daughter like several times, and yet we like him, right? So he's like the protagonist. We're kind of rooting for him. Like we feel sorry for him, despite the fact that he's got this like crippling gambling addiction, that despite the fact that he's got a bunch of money and can basically like AFK for the rest of his life, he actually decides that he's going to go and like play again. So there are a couple of important features of gambling, pathologic gambling, or behavioral addictions. So one of them is impulsivity, and the second one we're going to talk about is like future discounting. So the brains of people with behavioral addictions tend to be like more impulsive. So they have difficulty restraining their impulses, and they also have difficulty sort of planning for the future, and they tend to choose short-term gain over like long-term gain. So there are experiments that have been done in people who have behavioral addictions. And what we've discovered is that if you take someone with a behavioral addiction, you're like, I'm going to give you $1 now or $10 tomorrow. The person with a behavioral addiction is more likely to choose a $1 now than someone who doesn't have a behavioral addiction, who will go for like the long-term gain. And we kind of see this in his life, right? Like no matter like what his situation is, he's going to go for that, you know, high yield short-term play, like irrespective of his situation. I think there are a couple of other things that are really cool that they demonstrate in this show, and I really like the way that they portray addiction, because a lot of times people with addiction get, they actually get like blamed for their addiction. So for many years, addiction was kind of viewed as like, you know, a moral deficiency, or like it's their fault and people can just get up and like just stop drinking or just stop gambling, bro. And so it's sort of viewed as a moral disease. And I think that if you look at episode 6 in particular, right? So like the reason that episode 6 is so powerful is because we know that Gihun is a good guy. Like his daughter, despite the fact that he's like chain failing his daughter like still loves him and cares about him, and she sort of understands that in a sense it's not his fault and he's like a decent human being. He just can't control the gambling. And so that's actually what makes episode 6 so powerful, is because that's the first time that we see him actually being like morally deficient. And that's what makes it so devastating, is that this is a good dude who's got like, you know, a problem, that he's got an addiction, which sort of like isn't his fault. And there are things that he can do kind of better for sure. But like in episode 6, we kind of see like the moral decay that he has, and we kind of know that morally he's like a good person. And so I think it's sort of a really good portrayal of addiction, because people with addictions aren't bad people. They're normal people who have these kinds of addictions. I think the show also does a good job of like demonstrating what it's like to grow up with a parent who has an addiction. So we kind of see this in his daughter, because like, you know, she kind of knows what to expect. And so we see a lot of like, you know, impulsive decisions that he makes. He gets super frustrated when he loses, but he can't kind of stay away. And one of the saddest things that I've worked with, I'm going to use that phrase a lot today, but one of the most challenging things or saddest things that I've worked with is like kids of parents who have addictions, because the kid kind of knows like that the parent just can't be relied on until the addiction gets under control. And so when I work with parents who have addictions, you know, fixing the addiction is step one, but unfortunately, like, that's just step one. And what we also have to do is repair the relationship with the child. So I think kind of in conclusion, you know, Gihun is someone who's like low on money, like has this impulsivity, has this like future discounting problem where he can't make like good long-term decisions for himself. He'll just randomly like, you know, dye his hair red. And it can be pretty devastating on the children of people with addictions, which is like just a sad truth. If you're someone, you know, who falls into this kind of category where like you can't help but make, you know, bad decisions that are like short-term gain, I strongly encourage you, this is something y'all are going to hear a lot, like if you relate to Gihun and you have these kinds of problems, I would recommend that you like go and get evaluated or supported by a mental health professional. Another important thing to remember here is that, just another kind of disclaimer is that, you know, remember that psychiatric illness is not binary. So like people will get a diagnosis and we sort of treat it as binary, right? Either you get diagnosed with an addiction or you don't get diagnosed with an addiction. Whereas the truth is that like addiction is like a continuous spectrum. And when we sort of establish a diagnosis is when it sort of crosses a particular threshold. But even if you're someone who doesn't have like as impaired of a life, like if an addiction that you have or an addictive behavior you have hasn't screwed over your life as much as Gihun's screwed over his life, you can still go get professional help for it, right? If you're someone who's like highly impulsive and like you can't stay away from a particular thing that's bad for you, even if you're able to maintain, like this is kind of the idea of a functioning alcoholic, even if you're able to maintain like a decent life and like decent family stuff, decent career stuff, you should still consider getting help around it. So that's Gihun, and his is an addiction, okay? Next up, we have Sae-byeok. I don't know how to pronounce this, right? So she's someone who, as best as I could tell, and I'm still not entirely 100% sure about this, escaped from North Korea, right? Tried to like reassure her brother. So we see like early on that her brother's in an orphanage and she's trying to like figure out a way to get her mom smuggled into North Korea. I mean, out of North Korea. So she sort of drops her brother off at the orphanage, or her brother is staying at an orphanage, and she's trying to make things happen. If you kind of like look at her, she like doesn't smile much, right? She doesn't like relate to other people. She's kind of a loner. She distrusts people. She kind of keeps to herself. And then what we'll see like a couple of scenes where like she's kind of quiet and reserved except for a few situations. So one really illustrative scene is when she goes to like the, I don't know what they're called, but like the people who will smuggle people out of North Korea. And he's kind of like, yeah, sorry, like I wasn't able to help. And then she's like gets very, very like, she becomes kind of unstable and like, you know, burns him with hot tea. And we kind of see that pattern again and again, like throughout the show, where she's sort of like calm and reserved and she seems like in control of her emotions, except when there's like an explosion of emotion and some degree of like emotional instability, and that she has a lot of trouble like trusting people. So I think if we kind of go back to our list of, you know, what our diagnoses are, I think she bears features of an attachment disorder. So this is going to be kind of tricky to understand. But we're going to kind of try our best. So what tends to happen when people are traumatized early in life is that the trauma can manifest in different ways. So we've done research, for example, on like cases of like genocide in a particular country, right? Where not everyone who experiences some kind of shared traumatic event necessarily has the diagnosis of PTSD. So traumatic experiences or emotional abuse or things like that can manifest later in life in a variety of different ways. So for some people, it manifests as PTSD, but I think Sae-byeok is like a good example of what seems to me like attachment issues. So then the question kind of becomes like, what are attachment issues? So there have been a group of researchers that really looked at something called attachment theory. And attachment theory is kind of an exploration of how human beings form connections. And so in situations where children grow up with parents who are like emotionally supportive and most importantly, like emotionally mirroring, they tend to develop healthy attachment styles. And so what that sort of means, just to give you guys kind of an example, is like when I'm growing up and I'm a 1-year-old child, I don't really understand what I feel, right? Like 1-year-olds they don't even understand what they feel, and they certainly can't articulate their feelings. They can barely talk. So how does a child understand, like make sense of the world and understand like how they feel? They do it through mirroring. So when a child, trips and falls down, if the parents express concern and support, the child learns a couple of important things. One is that like the facial expression of the parent tells the child whether they should be worried or not. And you guys may have seen this where if a child trips and falls and everyone around them laughs, the kid will like get up and laugh too, and they'll feel totally fine. If the child trips and falls and everyone panics, then the child will start crying, right? So what the child feels is actually determined by sort of the facial expressions of people around them. And so what happens in healthy attachment is that a child grows up and like, when they get hurt, the parents around them will express concern. They'll be emotionally supportive. So not only does the child understand what they feel, they also come to understand that the world is like a safe and secure place. Because when I trip and fall down and people like treat me with like love and respect and care, I begin to see the world as like a place that is going to be supportive of me, right? And if the world is going to be supportive of me, then I can learn to trust the world and trust people in the world. The flip side of that is people who grow up in households where parents are not good at emotional mirroring, or not good at support, or like traumatic kind of situations, in which case the world is not a safe place. You're growing up in a PvP zone versus a PvE zone. And so like the PvP world is like very dangerous because people can attack you, right? Parents, like when kids trip and fall and you've got a parent who yells at the child for being an idiot and being clumsy, suddenly, like when the child needs emotional support in TLC, instead what they're getting is like blame and like anger and frustration from the parent. And so that's the kind of stuff that sort of results in attachment disorders. And so disorders of attachment kind of have a couple of like key and common features. There's a lot of specificity to what I'm saying. But the key features are like a difficulty like trusting people, right? A difficulty with like social problems, and like a difficulty with like emotional lability. So people with attachment problems have difficulty forming relationships with other people and like learning how to trust other people. So I see this a lot, for example, in people who have difficulty forming like romantic relationships. So some people may be able to like date initially, but then they just can't like let their guard down and be vulnerable with another human being. They can't trust another human being to like take care of them. So instead they have to always have their walls up and can't form real authentic connections. And what we see with Sae-byeok is that she's not like a bad person or anything, or maybe you can argue that she is, but she seems like a decent human being who just grows up or believes that the world is like a distrustful place. And where did she kind of learn that? She learned that probably like presumably growing up in North Korea and like, people not caring for her, and like, she's like just inherently distrustful. And we kind of see this in people who have problems of disordered attachment. And so as a result, they have a lot of difficulty like forming relationships with other people. So if you're someone who kind of grew up, in a situation where your parents maybe weren't consistently supportive, or you grew up kind of like in today, you sort of think that the world is like an unsafe place, like operating in the world gives you a lot of anxiety, like you can't trust people, you can't count on people, you can't form connections with people because you have your guard up. That sort of makes me think about attachment-related issues. There isn't a discrete diagnosis here, by the way, but I still think that it's worthwhile to kind of go see a licensed mental health professional. Okay? So that's Sae-byeok, attachment issues. So next, what we're going to do is actually talk about a less, kind of more of a side character. because I think it forms a nice contrast. Next person that we're going to take a look at is Gihun. So this is a character that, once again, is like kind of quiet, right? So she kind of keeps to herself. She's not sort of quite as volatile as Sae-byeok is, but she's sort of a loner. She doesn't really care about forming connections. She's kind of AFK. She just sort of joins up when she has to. And she's just kind of like AFK and kind of chilling, right? So she doesn't like say a whole lot. She doesn't do a whole lot. She's not like particularly playful. She's not particularly like, she's not even like paranoid in the way that Sae-byeok is. She's just sort of like AFK. The one interesting thing is that she kind of gets super pissed off when she like talks to the religious dude, or when the religious dude like talks about religious stuff. So if we're kind of looking at what her diagnosis is, I think this is a really good example of like PTSD or even complex PTSD. So this is a good example of, I think the show does a good job of demonstrating how trauma can manifest in different ways. So people with PTSD or complex PTSD tend to feel empty. They kind of feel worthless. They feel different from other people. They feel like nobody understands them. And as a result, they avoid relationships. There's also features of kind of like dissociation when it comes to PTSD. And people, when they sort of feel empty on the inside and they have trouble like relating to other people. And if we kind of look at her story, she kind of talks about how her dad was sort of very abusive. It's not really clear in what way her dad is abusive, but I kind of got the vibe that he was sexually abusive to her and was like super religious about it. And so she also like lost her mom and things like that. And so people who have been traumatized like consistently. So this is where complex PTSD, the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD is that you can get sort of sexually assaulted once or get, you know, in a car accident or something like that, and you can develop PTSD from a single event. What some people have started to discover is that when people get repeatedly traumatized, like over and over and over again, it manifests slightly differently from like regular PTSD. And that's when we sort of explore things like complex PTSD. So based on her history, it really sounds like she grew up in a repeatedly traumatic environment. And I think they actually do a very good job of like showcasing some of the features of complex PTSD. And so she kind of feels like, you know, she can't connect to people. She's sort of like dissociative, which is sort of what that going AFK is, right? She doesn't feel a whole lot of things. And one of the things that she really, they do a good job of portraying is like she's kind of AFK, except when it comes to religious people. And so if we kind of look at it, you know, I think that's a really good example of like a trigger, right? So she was abused by someone who was hyper-religious. And so as a result, like anytime someone is religious around her, she like gets really, really pissed off, and it triggers like a lot of negative feelings. Another thing to remember about trauma is that in my work as a psychiatrist, I think about trauma as the great chameleon of psychiatry. So it can look like depression, it can look like bipolar disorder, it can look like just feeling AFK or being empty. You know, it can feel like people are just like damaged and don't have self-worth. So they have, and this is kind of important. So like when someone gets traumatized at a young age, their sense of like their internal sense of self gets like damaged. They don't really feel like a person on the inside. And that's kind of hard to describe. If you feel like a person on the inside, that'll be like confusing for you. And if you've been traumatized and don't feel like a person on the inside, like that may make sense. And you may be very confused by people who have this like sense of positive identity. And so if your sense of self-worth on the inside is damaged and you don't know who you are, basically, it's hard to have a goal. Right? It's hard to have a purpose because in order to like have a purpose, you have to be a main character. You have to know what you are on the inside. It's also hard to have relationships because a relationship involves like a connection between two people. And if you're kind of empty on the inside and you don't know who you are in the inside, it's really hard to have a relationship with someone because like you don't really understand who you are. So I think trauma is kind of interesting because it really can masquerade as all kinds of different things. Right? They can masquerade as people being checked out, or some people may look at Ji-yeon and say like, oh, she's depressed. But I really think it's a good kind of media portrayal, like a simplistic kind of hyperbolic portrayal of CPTSD, or complex trauma. So the last thing that I'll kind of point out is that, like, so people with complex trauma tend to feel like they're worth less than other people. And so she kind of, we even sort of see this where sometimes people with trauma will also have suicidality, and she has no problem, sacrificing herself for someone else. And so this in a show is kind of like very positive, right? Like, we feel like, oh my God, she's like, so like, she's such a good person, and she like sacrifices herself for her friend. And we'll get to that relationship in a second. But I think there's unfortunately a sinister undercurrent to this, which is, and she even sort of says this, right? She's like, your life is like worth more than mine is. And the really sad thing is she kind of says like, oh, I don't have parents anymore and I don't have anyone in life. And so you may even objectively like get on the same page with her and say like, okay, yeah, she doesn't have someone, right? Like Sae-byeok has to stay alive for her brother and has to stay alive for her sister. But there's a really sad undercurrent to this, which is like, why doesn't she have anyone, right? And so she's like presumably in her like early 20s, I would guess, or whatever. But because of her trauma, because of the way that she was raised, she's actually like not able to form connections. So she's a loner, and it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other interesting thing about trauma is even if she did have people, and so this is where, if she was a real person, we may actually discover that she does have people in her life. Maybe she has a boyfriend. Maybe she has people who care about her. Maybe she has siblings. But people with trauma feel so worthless on the inside that it feels like they don't have anyone, because they can't actually connect to anyone, because no one really understands them and they don't understand other people. So that's Gihun. The next thing that we're going to kind of talk about for a second is broken relationships that form between traumatic people, or traumatized people. So this is something that I've seen a lot as a psychiatrist. So if you look at like two of the people who have trauma, they basically band together, right? So like there's Sae-byeok who's a loner and Gihun who's a loner. And so like they end up kind of pairing up. And this is something that is at the same time beautiful and sad. I've seen this so much, especially in like residential trauma treatment, where people who feel broken, like I feel like half of a person. And what happens is I tend to gravitate towards other people who are also like broken. So I've seen this in a way, it's kind of beautiful that like two people with trauma both feel broken. They feel like half of a person, so they can sometimes feel whole when they get together. And so I've seen a lot of like, there's almost like a sense of kindred spirits where when you've been traumatized and you don't really know who you are and you feel like fundamentally broken on the inside, they're like all the normal people that you can't relate to, but there are people who are just as broken as you are, and like there's a sense of like kindred spirits, and there's this idea that two halves make a whole. And these are two people that are both confused by like the other people around them, right? They can't connect with them, but there's actually like a connection that can form between two people who've been traumatized. Unfortunately, while these people are drawn to connections with each other, I would say that like these relationships tend to be very, very difficult, because the truth is that two people who have difficulty forming connections, even though they're drawn to each other and they can understand each other, it's been my experience that a lot of these relationships don't end up working out well.
고마워. 나랑 같이 해줘서.
And that's just because like both people are like not, a lot of times they just like can't connect with each other, or there are other kinds of problems that arise where it doesn't seem to work out. So you can look at, one study, for example, that looked at borderline personality disorder, which also oftentimes has a root in trauma. And that like one of the treatments for borderline personality disorder is to actually form a stable relationship with like someone else who's healthy. And over a period of 2 years, that seems to really help the people with BPD. So unfortunately, the kind of fact remains, or I don't know if it's really a fact. I don't really have good statistics around this, but what I've kind of seen is that people who get together when psychiatrically hospitalized, and that may have nothing to do with the trauma, it may have to do more with sort of the fact that they're at their low point and their mental illness is like very, very active and bad at that point. That's probably a bigger factor. when people feel broken and they kind of connect, sometimes it doesn't turn out to be the best relationship. I've also seen the flip side of it. So this is like a good example in terms of addictions. So a lot of people will like fall in love in rehab, and that can be really fantastic. And I think I've seen a lot of people who are in recovery and can really support each other, two people who are in recovery and like working on sobriety together, and they start a romantic relationship and they actually end up like getting married and like staying sober and together for like 3 decades. I've seen those kinds of relationships and they can truly be amazing. Unfortunately, most of the relationships that I've seen, I'm just talking about anecdotally here as an addiction psychiatrist who does like inpatient and also residential treatment, a lot of times those relationships kind of don't work out. So if you're someone who's been traumatized, you know, it sort of makes sense that you'll sometimes be drawn to other people with trauma, but just be careful about that relationship. You know, recognize that that's going to be something that could be hard for you and could be hard for the other person, and that it's going to take a lot of like perseverance and compassion for that relationship to really work. Okay? To be fair, most relationships in general don't last. That's very true, right? So I think there are a lot of caveats to what I'm saying. I just wanted to kind of comment on this phenomenon that I've observed, that sometimes people who are broken are attracted to other people who are broken, and they can feel like a real and genuine connection in that way. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, honestly, like, I don't know the data. I've seen both scenarios. When it works out, it's actually like really amazing. And unfortunately, most of the times it seems like it doesn't work out great. Trauma bond is serious, absolutely. Right? So that's where I think it's important to remember that like you can bond with someone who's had a trauma without muddying that relationship with some kind of romance or sexuality, right? Like you can absolutely form a healthy trauma bond, and that's what we see in treatment, right? People will like get really close to each other. In recovery is a good example of like very, very powerful bonds that are formed because people are like walking a journey together that's difficult. And sometimes they'll screw up that bond by like contaminating it with other relationships, like going into business together or romance. Okay, so let's move on. So next up, we have hold on. Did I? Yeah. Sorry. So next up, we have Mi-nyeo. I don't know exactly how to pronounce her name, Mi-nyeo. So she's actually one of my favorite characters in the game, in Squid Game. So she's like super friendly, right? Smiles a lot. She like figures out what the power dynamic is and goes for the gangster. She, her relationships tend to like turn on a dime. So she'll be like super into someone 1 second and she'll be like not into them the next second. She's also like quite manipulative, and she's also hypersexual. So she's like willing to have sex at the drop of a hat. And so I don't know if you guys have a guess for this, but I think she is unfortunately the classic media portrayal of a woman with borderline personality disorder. So this is something that I think is actually like really unfortunate in media portrayals. But when people like try to demonstrate borderline personality disorder, they always make it a woman. And there is evidence that women are more likely to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder than men. But I do think basically it's like it's propagating something that may be statistically true, but sometimes I find it to be sort of like a harmful stereotype. So a lot of shows or movies will have like kind of this idea of the crazy ex-girlfriend, and that person will have features of borderline personality disorder. So BPD is characterized by a pattern of unstable relationships, mood fluctuations, like somewhat manipulative behavior, and the psychological defense mechanism called splitting. So we're going to talk about splitting for a second. So people with BPD, the core problem here is that their sense of self, like other traumatic illnesses, so some people who experience trauma early in life will develop something like BPD. So you can have kind of attachment issues, you can have PTSD, you can have complex PTSD, you can have BPD, you can also have like light versions of all of these things. So sometimes as psychiatrists, we won't diagnose someone with a disorder, but they sort of have what we'll call a borderline personality structure or organization. So it's not that this person really has an impaired function, like they can function normally in life, but they kind of have the psychological vulnerabilities that someone with BPD has. So these people, to other people, they feel very manipulative. And what's going on here? The core issue with BPD is that these people, someone with BPD's identity, and I'm oversimplifying here, okay? So you guys have to take this with a grain of salt. Who they are is determined by how they're treated. So if I'm treated with love and respect, I have a lot of self-esteem. But if I'm treated like crap, I will feel very, very worthless. And so this may be true to a certain degree of all people, right? Like if I get bullied by my entire school, like I'm going to feel like crap. And if I get treated like the best thing since sliced bread by my entire school, I will feel really amazing, right? I'll feel like egotistical and I'll feel great about myself. So this is a common element of like human psychology, but with BPD people, they're very, very sensitive to it. So, you know, they will feel amazing one day, and like the next day, if people like are slightly like if someone doesn't answer their texts, or you know people don't like respond to them the way that they kind of want to be responded to, their mood can really, really crash. So this sort of results in mood fluctuations. They're not bipolar. Like a lot of times people with BPD will like be diagnosed or think that they're bipolar because their mood fluctuates very, very rapidly. But their mood is heavily influenced by the way that they're treated. They also end up being manipulative, but I don't think that a lot of this is like conscious manipulation. What these people have sort of learned from like the way they've evolved and adapted is that if I feel loved, like if I can get someone to express love towards me, I will feel loved and I will be someone who is worth loving. So their identity is determined by the way that people treat them. And so what that sort of results in is like a lot of like manipulative behavior. So if I'm feeling unloved on a given day, I may express thoughts of suicide, or I may like express thoughts of like, you know, I'll do things that will make people care about me. Right. So I'll kind of like, you know, I'll do things that kind of evoke in other people like a desire to like take care of me and love me and like treat me with like, you know, like kid gloves and hug me and protect me and all that kind of stuff. So what these people will do is that I think a lot of people who are in relationships, not necessarily romantic relationships, but with people with BPD, is they'll feel like stuck and emotionally manipulated into kind of loving someone. So we'll also see this with like parent-child relationships, where parents who have BPD will like sort of emotionally hold their children hostage. So if you're in a relationship with someone with like a borderline organization, what that person feels like is what I would call an emotional hostage. Because if you try to pull away from them, if you try to like set boundaries with them, if you start to be unavailable to them, they'll escalate very rapidly and like force you into caring about them and not leaving and not taking a break. We also see this in some unfortunate cases with treaters, who when they go on vacation, like the person kind of falls apart, or the psychiatrist or therapist will feel like if I go on vacation, this person is going to like get hospitalized or may try to commit suicide. So unfortunately, people with BPD will sometimes hold people emotionally hostage. And that's where the kind of manipulation comes from. There's also a lot of like splitting going on. So what this means is that if they're interacting with some people, they will love some people and hate some people. So we'll see that, you know, for example, the person with borderline personality disorder who's hospitalized. So these are people who are at the lowest of their lows. So we try not to judge them for this because it's sort of not their fault. They're under a lot of stress. What they'll do is they'll like either love the doctor and hate the nurse, or they'll hate the doctor and love the nurse. And so what they tend to do is like create kind of social strife by kind of idealizing some people and really like viewing other people very negatively. So we'll also see this in other social situations where like they'll think that one person is like, you know, amazing and perfect and awesome, and everyone else is like terrible and crappy or things like that. So that's splitting. So they basically think very black and white about their relationships. And what this kind of results in when you have these high mood fluctuations, when you're very like sensitive to other people's opinions of you, when you kind of hold people emotionally hostage, when you try to manipulate people into treating you a particular way or not abandoning you, right? So a lot of times people with BPD will have a fear of abandonment, and we kind of see that in Mi-nyeo and the way that she works with like the gangster, where she's like, promise me that you'll never leave me, promise me that you'll go through this. So people with BPD will oftentimes like try to extract promises of fidelity from other people. And they'll kind of like, try to guilt trip you because you promised. I gave you everything that you wanted. Please love me. Please don't ever leave me. There's kind of this fear of abandonment. And what it does is it kind of drives people like a little bit crazy. So it can be really hard to be on the other end of that relationship. And so what that results in is very unstable relationships. So people with BPD, in unfortunate cases, will kind of use sexuality to feel loved. They'll like love and hate very quickly, and they'll sort of result in like unstable relationships. So she's kind of a good example of sort of the worst characteristics of people with BPD. One thing, I think it's another important disclaimer to toss out here, that she's kind of like kind of a textbook case or a fictional case of like the worst aspects of BPD. The good news is that I've also worked with a lot of borderline personality disorder folks. I actually really, really enjoy working with them. It's some of the most gratifying work that I've ever done. And I think they respond really, really well to some like Eastern principles of like discovering who you truly are. The best evidence-based treatment of BPD, in my opinion, is dialectical behavioral therapy, which has a large component of like mindfulness and like discovering who you are. So the good news is that, if you have BPD in real life, you're not like her. This is what I think is really unfortunate about media portrayals of BPD, is they like make them seem so unsympathetic. And then if you're like, oh my God, I'm this kind of person, like you're not this kind of person. She's like an absolute fictional version of BPD. And the real truth is that like people who have a borderline organization or people who have BPD are actually like wonderful, awesome people. They can be like wonderful people who just have these kinds of vulnerabilities and tendencies, but with help and support and patience, they can like, they don't have to give in to those tendencies. They can actually conquer it. And there are studies that have been done that have shown that essentially like BPD can be like, with good treatment and stable relationships, someone who acts this way in a year or two can actually no longer meet criteria for BPD. The behaviors kind of go away, not necessarily completely, but they're like no longer pathologic. So that's her. Next up, we have Deok-su, who's like our gangster, right? So he like backstabs people. He's a criminal. He's dominating. Like he doesn't really mind killing people. He's kind of like the first villain in the show. And so if we kind of go to our, what's his diagnosis, hopefully you guys can get this one, but it's sociopathy. So he's a great example of what I would call a low functioning sociopath. So this is where we got to talk a little bit about sociopathy. So sociopathy is sort of characterized by like a lack of empathy for other human beings. So what this kind of means is that they don't like, most human beings have sort of this internal moral compass that helps us understand like what is right and what is wrong. And people who are on the antisocial personality disorder spectrum, which is also like sociopathy, they're the terms, I'm going to use them interchangeably, basically like don't have that internal sense, or the internal sense is not as strong as it is in other people. So sociopathy is also a spectrum. So much like BPD, there are some people who are like very far on the bottom end of the spectrum and are highly sociopathic. And then on the other end of the spectrum are people who are very empathic and not sociopathic at all. And so people who are kind of like at the bottom end of the spectrum, or maybe the high end of the spectrum, if you're talking about sociopathy as a positive variable, people who are very sociopathic, let's put it that way, are people who like don't lack empathy and then like will do like cruel things to other people. So sociopathy in childhood is called conduct disorder, and like some of the more diagnostic features of conduct disorder are things like torturing animals and like setting fire to things. So people who are high on the sociopathy spectrum, or kids with conduct disorder, will sort of not respect property. They won't respect other people. They'll sometimes inflict harm on other people. Conduct disorder isn't necessarily sociopathy, though. A lot of times that also has to do with a traumatic upbringing. But sociopathy is sort of characterized by a lack of empathy and is, like, generally speaking, the traditional villain. So most villains in TV shows and movies and things like that tend to be sociopaths. There's an important point to understand about sociopathy research, which is that a lot of the sociopathy research comes from prisons. So, like, people who have what I would call low-functioning sociopathy tend to wind up being criminals. And so I think, honestly, sociopathy in a weird way kind of gets a bad name because most of the research is not done on normal people who have sociopathic characteristics. It's actually done on criminals. So when we think about sociopathy, we're sort of studying, like, the worst sociopaths and generalizing things about sociopathy. So this is where, if you really look at it, like, there are a lot of professions that where people are, like, highly functional and can live normal lives. And some of these professions will correlate with higher amounts of sociopathy. We're not talking, like, at the super high levels where it really kind of becomes a disorder. But if you look at things like executives, even if you look at things like professions like sometimes surgeons or psychiatrists, sometimes they can actually test highly on the sociopathy scale compared to the normal population. And the reason for that is that these professions require some amount of, like, emotional numbness, right? Like, if you are a psychiatrist and, like, you have patients that are committing suicide because, like, that's the population you work with, right? Like, that's sort of what, I mean, that's just what's going to happen. If you're a psychiatrist and you work with, like, the sickest populations that have the highest chance of suicide, then you are going to be dealing emotionally with a lot of suicide. As a result, you have to learn how to numb your emotions to kind of survive in those sorts of situations. CEOs kind of also have to do this sort of thing, right? Like, if you have to lay off 1,000 workers, it's protective or adaptive to be, like, a little bit callous at heart. The other thing to remember is that sociopathy is, like, a part of human evolution, right? So these people exist. And if they exist, there must be some kind of adaptive advantage to it. And we kind of see that in Squid Game because, like, this person really excels in this competitive, cutthroat environment. So this is also where you'll see people with, like, high sociopathy sort of excel in particular environments. So he also, you know, isn't worried about killing people. He doesn't really demonstrate remorse. He forms alliances not out of care or support or anything like that. All of his alliances form out of self-gain. And so he's also kind of like this classic demonstration of, like, a male sociopath. So this is also where we have to toss in another disclaimer, which is, like, if you get diagnosed with sociopathy, it does not mean you are this person, right? This is a caricature. He's a fictional representation. He's, like, the worst characteristics of sociopathy, like, embodied within a fictional character. This is also where, generally speaking, in media portrayals, you'll have women who get women tend to exemplify the worst characteristics of BPD, and men tend to exemplify the worst characteristics of sociopathy. So next up, we've got Gihun. So this is a dude who's kind of quiet, doesn't really form a whole lot of very close connections. He's kind of like, he's not quite AFK, but he's, like, kind of, like, neutral. He's going to try to win. You know, you can kind of see, I think they do a really good job of showing and not telling here, where, like, you know, the main character, Gihun, is so happy to see, sorry, this is Sang-woo. So Sang-woo is smart. He's successful. He's, you know, he's in finance. He got into some kind of problem with, like, fraud and embezzlement. He's sort of desperate. He's kind of image conscious. He winds up being, you know, I guess the second villain. And I think they do a really good job of catching a lot with his facial expressions. Whereas, like, Gihun is, like, very genuine and wants to be friends and, like, wants to work together. And Sang-woo is kind of, like, holding back a little bit, right? He works together out of, he forms alliances also out of self-gain. And there's the episode where he kind of has the idea of, like, the sugar game and, like, you know, what we're going to have to do. And he's sort of he remembers that in the sugar game, like, okay, like you should have an easy shape, right? So, but instead of like sharing this information with his team, he actually goes ahead and like says, hey, we should split up. So he actually subtly tries to sandbag and kind of actually get Gihun killed, right? So his diagnosis is actually sociopathy as well. So he's a good example of what I would call a high-functioning sociopath. So this is where, like I kind of said, that if you look in some industries, people test highly on the sociopathy scale. And so he feels some degree of empathy, right? He's not completely like cold-hearted and numb. He does some amount of caring, but he actually shares a lot of features with the gangster, right? He's going to like kind of throw people under the bus. He's going to go for himself first. He's going to try to form alliances for self-gain. He's very competitive. He's sort of immoral and has this ends justifies the means kind of attitude. I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. He'll sort of throw people under the bus. And frankly, I've seen a lot of this in finance. So when you work in investment banking and private equity, unfortunately, there's a lot of like cutthroatness to it, right? Some people are kind of cutthroat. They're gunners. I also see this in medicine, and doctors can sometimes test higher on the sociopathy scale than the average person. So in medical school, you'll have some students who are like gunners, like they're going to be number one. And if they have to leave a trail of like, failing medical students behind them, they're willing to do that. They're the kind of people that will ask for notes, but if you ask them, they'll be like, sorry, I don't have them, and they'll actually lie to your face. They'll also do things like throw people under the bus. So we'll see this kind of in different kinds of work environments. You may know people at work who will be the first to claim credit, but they're like hyper competitive, and they'll kind of throw you under the bus if you do something wrong. So I think this is a better example of what I call kind of high-functioning sociopathy. So these are people who are less empathic or kind of highly competitive, and we can see how sociopathic characteristics can result in people succeeding in the world, right? And we can also remember that Sang-woo, despite being the top of his class and the pride of his neighborhood, went to Nationals, Seoul University or whatever NSU is, and then rose in finance, was super successful, and then got into some fraud and embezzlement kind of stuff, right? And so if we look at the industry of finance, no one's that surprised that people in finance are doing shady stuff, right? You can look at the GameStop stuff, the GME stuff, Citadel Securities and Robinhood, and people are just doing shady stuff in finance. People did shady stuff in finance in Enron. They did shady stuff in 2007, 2008. And so a lot of people, there are some industries where these high functioning people who are sort of higher on the sociopathic scale, but are actually really smart and don't wind up in jail, where you find these people. So he's kind of an example of a high-functioning sociopath. The good news is that they do feel empathy, right? And Sang-woo isn't all evil. He's not like the gangster. And I've also worked with a lot of sociopaths who do feel empathy, want to try to be good people, and they can actually be very good people. I think he is also a negative portrayal of it, where when you put him into the pressure of a life and death situation, he's going to choose himself first. And they do a good job if you watch his facial expressions of between the first episode and the last episode, his internal struggle, and sometimes he helps people and sometimes he doesn't, right? And so they kind of do a good job of that. And even if you're a high functioning sociopath, I've worked with a lot of them. I mean, they don't really meet criteria for the illness. They're not really, don't have the disorder, but they kind of have a low empathy sort of ends justifies the means kind of makeup, right? They're kind of Machiavellian. The good news is that they can actually be very good people and can care for other people as well. So next up, we've got Oh Il-nam. So this is the other guy who sort of turns out to be the villain, right? So he's kind of got this weird situation where he apparently is very financially successful, and he's got a brain tumor and his time is running out. And he's a very likable and genuine guy. We all love him. We're rooting for him. We feel compassion towards him. Once again, Ganbu episode 6 is the episode where he gets taken advantage of, and it's the highest amount of feels in the show. I think it's clearly the best episode in the show. And so he kind of comments that people without money and tons of money are the ones that like kind of feel empty inside. And he's decided to orchestrate the Squid Game to try to feel alive, right? Which sounds super, super screwed up. So what's his diagnosis? So he certainly has features of sociopathy, but this is where I'm going to actually go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and debate y'all a little bit, and then I'm going to add something else. So I'm going to add what I call Buddha syndrome. And this is what I'd say this guy really exemplifies. So Buddha syndrome is something that, the reason I call it that is because it was actually characterized like by Buddha. So Buddha was a guy who had everything and ended up feeling empty and unhappy, right? So he was loved, he was respected, he was powerful, he was wealthy. And then he kind of wakes up one day and sort of like feels empty inside. And he's like, this does not bring me happiness. So he sacrifices everything. He gives everything up. So it takes a slightly different approach from Oh Il-nam, who Oh Il-nam is like, in order to feel alive, I'm going to create the Squid Game and like, fight for my life. And if you guys even look at like red light, green light, you can see Oh Il-nam really enjoys the games, right? He longs to feel alive in some way. And so he like goes back to his childhood and stuff like that to try to recapture some sense of happiness before he became rich and before he became successful and before he started to feel empty. And so Buddha sort of described this, and what Buddha sort of discovered is that like no amount of money will necessarily buy happiness. And I think there are some issues with that. But what Buddha basically discovered is that like suffering and contentment doesn't have to do with material things. Now, there's some scientific research that kind of opposes this, right? So if you look at research on happiness, for example, that like happiness does correlate with material security for sure up to a particular point. So my personal take, trying to reconcile Buddha's approach, which I think there's a lot of wisdom to, and science, is that money is necessary but not sufficient for happiness. So money will protect you from, feeling despair on some level and feeling insecurity, and can protect you from stress, but it is not sufficient to be happy. And success and being like, rich in life can actually result in feeling empty. And this is something that we see a lot within celebrities, right? So like we'll see this in Twitch streamers, we'll see it in celebrities, we'll even see it in trust fund babies, which is like these people seem to have everything and yet they're not happy. And this is where personally I feel like a little bit frustrated, because it's been my experience. I've had, rich and privileged patients who commit suicide. And I've had, poor and like, persecuted patients commit suicide. And the sad truth is that I think somewhere along the way as a society, we've stopped being compassionate towards people who have privilege. And I think that there are some good reasons for this, right? Like it's not like we should devote all of our compassion towards people who are lucky or rich or beautiful. I do think that we should try to devote, a lot of our resources and our care and our compassion in a lopsided manner towards people who have it worse off than people who are lucky or rich or successful. But I do think it's like fundamentally wrong that we don't demonstrate compassion towards like people who are suffering in any way, shape, or form. And this is where, as the internet or as society, we tend to have like a very like love-hate relationship towards people who are celebrities, right? So like a good example of this is when Robin Williams commits suicide, like the whole world is there for him. But when a lot of celebrities complain about being depressed, like the internet will jump down their throat. They'll be like, why are you depressed? What do you have to complain of for? You're so privileged, you're so attractive, you're so rich, you have nothing to complain about, right? It's kind of interesting, but I just personally, like, I don't agree with that. I think that as human beings, like, we all deserve compassion. And is privilege a part of the equation? Absolutely. Like, I'm not saying that we should, prioritize everyone the same amount. But I do think that it's kind of unfair that, like, just because someone has privilege, that we sort of allow ourselves as a society to actually, like, attack them. It's not just a lack of compassion. We don't treat them, neutrally, right? Like, what we actually do is attack them. And then it puts them in a very interesting situation, unfortunate situation. And you guys will have seen this when we talk to streamers, is they're not allowed to complain. And like, I think one of the most devastating things, one of the most isolating and lonely things that you can do to someone is not allow them to complain and not allow them to like open themselves up for support from other people. And it's super kind of sad. And I think this is where actually our community in Twitch has been really fantastic, where, you know, there are super privileged people who have come on our stream and have shared with the world that like their life is not perfect. And I really love this community because this community rises above the judgmentalness of the internet, and we treat people like the way they deserve to be treated, right? We look past hatred, we look past political differences, we look past wealth and power and beauty, and we can treat people with compassion. And I think if we genuinely want to make the world a better place, crapping on people who are lucky is like not the right way to do it. So he, at the end of the day, has what I would call Buddha syndrome, which is that when you're privileged, you start to feel empty in life. And I much prefer Buddha's method of kind of resolving that, which is to, seek like the true meaning of happiness through like introspection and meditation and exploration, as opposed to create a game where people have to kill each other to survive. I think there's also a theme that is kind of lived out in Saw as well, if you guys have seen the Saw movies, where he's like trying to help people discover life through like, trying to kill them, which I don't think is a good thing to do. So we're going to go ahead and pause for a second. So this has been sort of like my exploration of Squid Game. I think it's a wonderful TV show. It's super hype. And I think it actually does a really good job of portraying, caricatures of mental illness. So I do think that, if you watch these things, like, I don't want y'all, if you guys don't understand these diagnoses and haven't met people like this, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking, oh, like, this is what sociopathy looks like, this is what PPD looks like, this is what addiction looks like. They do a good job of portraying it, but remember that real humans who suffer from these problems are very, very complex and have like a lot more to them than what the show portrays. At the same time, I think the show does a good job of showing like how good people and bad people can struggle with like mental health issues. I think the show is a beautiful exploration of trauma because it shows like how trauma can manifest in so many different ways. And I like it because I think they're doing a good job of like hopefully destigmatizing mental illness. Now, you can absolutely make the argument that what they're also doing is stigmatizing mental illness, which I think is probably somewhat true, especially when it comes to things like BPD and sociopathy. So, I hope to, part of the reason that I'm sort of sharing this with y'all is because I thought it was really interesting. I think it's cool that media is starting to really incorporate like aspects of mental illness into their portrayals of these stories. I think that mental illness is on the rise, and like 30 to 50% of people suffer from something or other. And, I think it's really neat that like they do this. One of the things that I'm super curious about is like how they do this. Like, is this something that they consulted like a psychiatrist or a psychologist for, or is it just within the consciousness of the people and of society that like people know that this kind of stuff exists and trauma can affect people in these ways, which I think would be super cool. I did have one teacher, I didn't have like a really close relationship with them, but there was one teacher at Harvard Medical School, a psychiatrist who like consulted for TV shows and stuff like that. And so I do know that happens. So I think it's kind of neat that, shows are kind of exemplifying this. So questions that y'all have. There are a couple of characters that I didn't get to, but frankly, I'm kind of tired. If you guys want to, we can do one or two more, but yeah, so in its defense, I think the show is based on a large number of people who have done bad things. Absolutely. So that's a great point. So remember that this is a show that's like demonstrating people under huge amounts of stress. And the way that I think about, mental illness and especially personality disorders is that these people can be completely normal. But when you put them under periods of high amounts of stress, some of these deeper vulnerabilities get exposed. Right? Like the internal weaknesses when you're put under pressure is like when you crack. And based on your personality organization structure, it determines the way in which you crack. So Ali. So I can talk about Ali quickly. So Ali is kind of interesting. So the two people that I didn't talk to is the hyper-religious guy and Ali.
아 괜찮아. 야 너희들이 진짜 잘 맞겠다.
So I think Ali is a good example of what I would call like cultural conditioning. So if you look at Ali, he has, he like values himself less than other people. So he keeps on addressing other people as sir. He doesn't like need respect from other people. He kind of like gets bullied by other people, right? Like he kind of like is a doormat. And this is kind of interesting, but I think this is absolutely like cultural conditioning. So the unfortunate truth is that in India, and not just India, but in India, I understand it really well. There used to be a caste system, or there still is a caste system. It used to be worse. It's gotten better, but it's still very present. And so like people are taught, like the idea that all human beings are equal is not something that the average Indian, at least 30 years ago, grew up with. There's like a tier of quality of human, right? So there's like a caste system, and like some castes are better than others. And you'll see this in India where there's like the servant class, and then there's like the wealthy class now. Those are the biggest things. And so, you'll have one household that has like 5 people living there, and then they'll have like 8 to 9 servants. And the servants get paid, very, very little amounts of money. Like they don't aspire to much, and everyone just sort of accepts that. That, like the servants will eat in a different way. I think Downton Abbey is like another good example of like a class-based representation of society, right? And some people in Downton Abbey are like uppity, and they want to be better than what they are. And some people like think that that's really bad. So I think it's basically cultural conditioning, and he's probably like a low caste person, which is what you tend to see. So a lot of these like low caste people are forced to like leave the country to look for work elsewhere because they don't have good prospects in their home country. He's actually not Indian. I think Ali is Pakistani. So I think in the Indian subcontinent, you'll see in South Asia, you'll see this, I assume in Pakistan. I just don't have a whole lot of experience, which is why I'm talking about India. You'll see it in Bangladesh too. So there's a lot of, for example, workers that will leave the Indian subcontinent and will go to the UAE, will go to the MENA region, will emigrate to, I guess, Korea and stuff like that. They're basically looking for a better life. It's something that, my family did. So my parents emigrated from India and came to the United States looking for a better life. They were, generally speaking, higher caste people. So their ambition and their self-respect, like they understood as human beings that they were like sort of entitled to some amount of like success and fair play. And I think that was like a big part of like why they emigrated and why they became doctors and stuff like that. And it's also where sometimes I think it's a little bit unfortunate that, when we try to look at equality, we tend to look at race, which I don't think necessarily is a bad thing, but I think there are shortcomings. And I remember just sharing one example. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to have racial equality, so hopefully this won't get taken out of context. But I just want to share one example with y'all. So when you are South Asian and you take the medical college admissions test in the United States, in order to be competitive, you basically have to score 2 points higher, or what used to be 2 points, or maybe like 10 to 20% higher than the average applicant to have a chance to get in. So like, the deck is actually stacked against you if you're South Asian. So that I think sort of makes sense because in the United States, you have like tons of like Indian doctors, right? And like because the people who emigrated, most of the people who came to the United States were successful and prioritized academics. So for example, like I had certain advantages, like my parents could pay for like a medical college admissions test prep course, right? So I've got like some systemic advantages which sort of explain why on average like we do better. And also like the medical colleges are trying to like not have, 50% classes who are South Asian. So they sort of like will treat South Asians slightly differently. I think the downside is that unfortunately medical schools sort of don't recognize or don't have the sophistication to account for like poor Indian people. So if you think about the Indian subcontinent, most of them didn't grow up with the privilege that I grew up with. So I was basically a mentor to a low caste Indian kid, a Dalit was the caste that they were in, from like South India, and like he was screwed. Like he had none of the advantages that I had. His parents were poor. His mom and dad were both like cleaning people at a hotel where they worked illegally for less than minimum wage, and they were actually like victims of, I think, a predatory hiring practice of like higher caste Indian people. So they came to the U.S. to give opportunities for their son, and they got paid like $3 a day plus like room and food. And so they were actually victims, and like the Dalit kid that I was advising like had none of the advantages that I had. But when it comes to medical college admissions, like he checks a particular box, and when he shows up for an interview, he's actually playing with the same disadvantage that I am. So I don't actually begrudge the disadvantage that I dealt with, because at the end of the day, I still got into medical school, even though the deck is stacked against me. And that's because I think it sort of balances out. I think, unfortunately, the Dalit kid, I mean, that kid was kind of screwed, right? So he gets judged based on the color of his skin and gets like plays at a disadvantage. So I hope that as we really start to move towards like more sophisticated avenues of equality, like I would love it if society could give that kid a break that he deserves. But going back to Ali, I think that Ali is just a good example of this kind of cultural conditioning of like different castes and different, different like a class-oriented conditioning. So what's wrong with the caste system? So I'm not necessarily saying that the whole I don't know enough about the caste system to say that it's blanketly wrong, but I do believe that it is unfair. So I think it's like unfair when some people grow up and are in a situation where they like basically are trapped, right? They don't have resources, they don't have education, their parents aren't educated, their parents don't emphasize education, their parents can't earn money. I think that that's unfair. Like, I think it's unfair that some people are born with so many advantages, and like, I don't think that it's good for a cultural system to propagate inequality. And my understanding of the caste system is that it does propagate inequality. Now, if you say that the caste system does not propagate inequality, then I'll accept that, because I'm not an expert in the caste system. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm not a sociologist. I didn't grow up in India, right? So I understand some stuff about caste, but that's as a second-generation immigrant who grew up in East Texas. So if people are going to make arguments that the caste system is good, like, by all means make those arguments, and I'm happy to listen. I'm not saying I'm right. It's just my opinion, and it's not something I'm an expert in. But I do think it's like, I think, like, how can I say this? When I look at the Dalit, and that's why I mentored him, right? So, like, I tried to do what I could to, like, fix it, which is going to be like, hey, bro, like, let me help you, because I understand this stuff and I was given opportunities to learn. So what I think is unfair is that, I mean, like, we're not even playing in the same game. Like, it's like, he's playing on ping, like a ping of 400, and I'm playing on like a ping of 20, and we're competing. And, medical schools are going to look at us, not the same, because I think medical schools are, people try. They try to not, on the one hand, they sort of judge people by the color of their skin, but on the other hand, they also try to recognize that, like, there's socioeconomic status. So I personally think that socioeconomic status is a better way to try to, like, balance things. I think it's just harder, right? But I do think that I would like a world where the discrepancy between the advantages that I was given and my Dalit mentee were less. I think it's unfair to him. And it's my understanding, and this could be wrong, that a lot of that is propagated by caste. And if you say otherwise, then by all means, tell me I'm wrong and explain it to me. I would love if someone could post a little bit. If you guys think that the caste system is good and is helpful, I'd love to see a subreddit post about it. So you said money is necessary but not sufficient for happiness. What is sufficient for happiness? I think detachment. So devoting yourself to detachment is the key to happiness. I think that's what Buddha basically discovered, is that when people develop detachment from expectations and focus on the present, like, so it's present focus, devoting yourself to the action in term, as opposed to the outcomes of your actions, and detachment. I think that's the formula for happiness. And I feel really confident about this because I've taken people who are miserable and I've taught them this and they become happier. Right? So I'll get like CEOs who are very rich and they'll come to me and they'll say, hey, I'm unhappy. Can you help me? And I'll say, sure. They'll say I'm depressed. Then I'll talk to them. I'll do a thorough diagnostic interview where I ask them 60 questions. And then I'll say, you're not depressed, you're unhappy. They're like, wait, what? What do I do about that? I'll be like, let me show you. Indians are in tech and doctors because decades of diligence standing on the shoulders of their parents' sacrifices. I agree completely. Right? So I stand on the shoulders of my parents. Everything that I am is due to their sacrifice. So I want you guys to understand, like, people look at me like I'm something amazing. I want y'all to understand that I grew up in a household with 2 loving parents, and I had the luxury of spending 7 years training to become a monk without having to really worry about paying my bills. Do you guys realize how OP of a start that is? Like, it's one of the most OP starts you can have. And so it's my belief that if you're someone who's born with privilege, I can still suffer, by the way, so I'd appreciate some compassion when life is rough for me. But I believe it is my responsibility to, like, take my spawn and then, like, build alliances with other people who had less advantageous spawns, right? Because we're in this game together. It's co-op. So if I have a really good spawn, it's my job to help people who, like, didn't have as good of a spawn to even things out, because that's the only way it's going to work. Actually, that's not necessarily true. It's my solution. So I tend to focus on helping people directly. There are lots of people out there who will propose political solutions, passing laws, advocacy. All of those things are great too. It's just not what I specialize in. So I don't know how to get a law passed. And it's my experience that, you know, some of those systems, like, need improvement, and, like, the way the sausage is made is just too complicated. So I prefer to just help. I'm just going to mentor the Dalit kid instead of, like, lobby my congressman. Not saying it's the right way. It's just what I know how to do, and it's my advantage. I didn't go to law school. I went to med school. So simple solution seems to be look at income rather than ethnicity. So here's the thing. If there was a simple solution, I think someone would have figured it out. So my experience of solving inequality is that a simple solution is not going to work, right? Like, if you really look at, for example, like, becoming healthy is not easy. It's a multifactorial solution. It involves exercise, it involves diet, it involves meditation, it may involve coaching, it may involve therapy, it may involve watching YouTube streams, it may involve having, a yard where you can garden, it may involve having a pet, right? So having a pet correlates with, like, increased life expectancy and better mental health. So to say that the solution to mental health problems is just to send everyone to therapy, it may seem like a simple solution because that's the treatment for mental illness. So, like, let's just send everyone to therapy. I disagree. I think the solution to mental illness may involve therapy, but it may also involve, like, getting people pets if they want one, improving social connections, helping people get off of social media, helping people exercise, helping people, like, support each other, doing things like group coaching where, like, people can learn their value, their internal sense of self-worth. I think that there's a lot of answers to it. Why is it not clearly wrong? I assume you're talking about the caste system. The short answer is I don't know. Like, I'm ignorant of the caste system. I'm not an expert in the caste system. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but I think a lot of people on the internet will judge things that they don't understand. Like, most people will judge things that they don't understand. So I've seen this a lot. Like, people will, this is Dunning-Kruger 101, that the more ignorant you are of something, the more simple it seems and the quicker you are to, like, have an answer. I think, honestly, if you look at a website like Reddit or Twitter, what most people should say is, I don't know. Like, if the correlation between opinions and, like, understanding things was 1 and 1, 90% of Twitter would be people saying, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, I don't know, because most people don't know things. We're happy to have opinions about things. It's the way our brain is wired. Our brain is wired to construct the illusion of certainty out of ignorance. That's what it does. So the reason that I don't think it's clearly wrong is just because I don't understand it. Like I said, I think it's wrong, but I haven't done a thorough study of the caste system and its advantages. we may discover that it has advantages. I do think that there's a lot of stuff between Eastern and Western stuff where Western people think that they are right, whereas I disagree with that. So like a good example of that is that in the West, the individual is considered more important than the community. So for example, like you'll have people advising each other that if you have, it's like okay to cut off your parents and never allow them to see your kids because there's no such thing as grandparents' rights, right? And I understand that perspective, like I get it. But in the East, they value the community over the individual. And they do think that there are things such as grandparents' rights. And all of society, or at least Western society, will think that like that is objectively wrong, that the parents' rights supersede the grandparents' rights. I think it's just a difference of values. I don't think it's objectively wrong. It's also the side that I fall on, right? So I kind of agree with that, but I think that's a good example of like, you know, I don't think that there's an objective right or wrong there. I think different societies have different value systems. And I try my best to not assume that the value systems that I hold are objectively correct. Because overwhelming research demonstrates that, for example, most of the humans in the history of humanity do not believe their religion after a thorough and critical analysis of all of the religions and then picking one. Most human beings believe their religion because that's what they were exposed to. So human beings also confuse objective correctness with the value system that they grew up in.